Thanks. Can you see me? Shall I stand? All right. Yeah, let me just make two kind of comments. First of all, I'll talk a bit about the fiscal context, which actually the Institute for Government where I've been very active looking at how other countries have recovered in previous times around this area. And then actually I want to take a slightly different direction about actually a different kind of asset, which Paul's talking about, not the one perhaps he has in mind. So in terms of fiscal context, we've heard the figures, it's all pretty grim. Yeah, Getty's Acts, 1920s, was the last time we saw such real terms cuts. And of course, at that time, you still had huge spending left over from the First World War, so it was relatively easy to clip, perhaps, on a lot of the spend that was going on there. The Institute's been quite hawkish about this, but on the other hand, I think the Treasury knows broadly how to do this. The worrying thing in the mix there is that the UK government is especially silo-based. I mean, most governments are silo-based, but the UK is especially so. In other words, Treasury can deliver good headline figures that can do that, but it tends to do it stupidly in the sense that what happens is every department, and right down into local service providers, will tend to protect their own core functions. So anything which is more innovative and cross-cutting actually tends to get squeezed, which is exactly not what you want to do, which is a different take on the investment line. Okay, the other thing I suppose that I just make a note about, which I do, we touched on a little bit, which I do worry about the number of things which still haven't been adjusted for in terms of the scale of the trade deficits and so on, the imbalances across the world. They remain very substantial, and these tensions built in, they trouble me. Some of the instruments which we use I still worry about. I have a lot of interest in behavioural economics. One of the things we learned from the banking situation, we always sort of thought that people, if they were exposed to more losses, in other words, if the banks went down and their position was contingent on that, then they'd be more cautious. But in fact, it looks like, for the most part, it's the reverse, where people were more exposed because they have such strong optimism biases. Like if you're into the market, your Lehman Brothers, whatever. Actually, optimism bias means you just discount all the positive losses and you just look at the upside. And so this seems to be one of the weird and wonderful things that we've come to understand through this crisis. And there's a danger that we actually go back to using some of the same standard economics in the solutions, which doesn't look like working well. Anyway, one of the things that happens in the wake of these consolidations, we saw it, for example, in Canada. Of course, it had a very bad shock in the around 93, finally came to adjust it. Now, of course, it's the lowest debt in the G8. All kinds of interesting innovations around public services. Similarly, Sweden, many of the innovations in public services which people are interested today, like the Stockholm school system, arose partly in the wake of what the Swedes had to do in that period. So one of the interesting things, which we all try to touch on, is that maybe good things will happen to people around these adjustments. I think one of them is that you start to look not only at the narrow economy, but you start thinking about other kinds of assets as well. And so in my book, The Hidden Wealth, that's essentially what it's about. It's about this other kind of economy which exists out there, which in policy-making world tends to get rather neglected. So let me just try and explain to you what that is briefly, and then just give you a couple of examples of why this is in practice relevant. So what is this? Kind of particularly sometimes called the economy of regard. I mean, if your friends invite you around for dinner and then you invite them back around some other time, it's a kind of transactional thing that goes on. And it has a sort of logic to it, a bit like the real economy, but rather different. So after your friends have invited you around, so cool, perhaps we're interested in such an interesting conversation today. And then I invite him back, whatever. But he just doesn't do this. He doesn't get out his wallet after that pleasant evening. So 30 quid, will that cover it? Why is that wrong? Why don't you do that? It's because it's lodged in a different kind of exchange system, sometimes called the economy of regard. Another illustration of it is social trust, right? Do you think other people can be trusted? So I can ask you this today. It's a question we've been using since the 1950s, and it goes along the lines of, do you think most other people can be trusted, right? And the answer is either yes or no, can't be too careful. So who would say yes to this question? Do you think most other people can be trusted? So who would say no? Quite a few aren't too sure. So a little reticent today. Well, anyway, in the UK, it's about 30% would say yes, a little under that. In Scandinavian countries, it's more like 60 to 70%. In Brazil, it's 3%. Now, why is this consequential? Well, it turns out, if you put it into a kind of big macroeconomic model, it's more important to the answer to that question than, for example, levels of human capital in a country, right? And why would that be? It's because if you trust each other, you don't have to, in every transaction, use a lawyer or insurance systems and so on. It's really very consequential. And partly then it's just rooted in this economy of regard. So why might this be then consequential once you start to get your head around it? Just give you one more sense of the scale of it. If you look at time budget studies and how do you actually spend your time, and adults above 18, if you average it across your lifespan, you'll spend about a quarter of your time in paid work, a quarter of your waking time. I know it feels like more than that, but you've got to take in weekends and retirement and all the rest of it. And you spend most of your other time, seeing your friends and hanging out with your kids and so on. And a lot of that is the economy of regard. If you monetarize that, which is a slightly odd thing to do, but it's more than GDP per capita. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there's this other kind of world, which in fact, far from being at the fringes, turns out in fact to be often larger than the real economy, and often in fact drives the real economy. So Christmas, for example, you go out and buy a load of things and you give them away to other people. It doesn't make much sense in the real economy, it makes a lot of sense in the economy of regard, where actually most of our lives are based. So, my quick 3 examples where practice might be useful. First of all, one of the few things, now there's a new fashion, something that's interested people in economic policy in a way that wasn't a few years ago, is information actually. Information turns out incredibly important. So you had a builder and you weren't happy with them, you actually end up with a very valuable piece of information. I'd never use them again, but how does anybody else know that? Because TripAdvisor type mechanisms mean that it's possible to share that information. It's one of the few things you can do. If you model it, it looks like you squeeze out your least productive every year and you increase the returns of the most productive at any given segment. It has enormous benefits from year to year. But actually it's premised on a kind of economy of regard at the moment. You'd share that information one to another. So that turns out to be huge. Public service, the next one. So if you look at areas you're going to try and trim down, we kind of implied its benefits in some extent aspects of public services. Well, you look at those big areas, social care, people worry about it very greatly, would be an obvious example. They look at the demographics, they look at the numbers, our colleagues are number 10, and think, oh my God, it's a nightmare. Well, you can harness the economy of regard, because a lot of it is in the economy of regard anyway. So the Japanese, who have the most advanced demographics, they have this system they had for quite a while now, called what's called care credit system, essentially. So I'm in Tokyo, I can't look after my parents, because they're 500 miles away, I look after someone else's parents. And I get these care credits, which I then give to my parents. And then they use that to buy, in inverted commas, care. But it's experienced qualitatively very differently. Now, when you start doing those things, you catalyse much more activity in this kind of area. And it has real fiscal gains, but it also has it makes the world a better place. So public service is very poor at asking that. So my son had a tracheostomy for 4 years. At the end of that, we were happy to say we've helped some other couple. If they had a child who had a similar problem. Of course, we were never asked. That offer was never taken up. So our public service don't ask the English citizens. Lastly, just to conclude then, I guess I'm trying to say is, if you ask this big question about kind of going forward, what is this world we want to have? It isn't just going to be more of the same kind of widgets or whatever, but it's something else. And one of the reasons why the economy of regard is so interesting is that our well-being, when you ask things about your life satisfaction, your happiness, is much more driven by that side than it is the real economy. So behind it are these great puzzles. Well, why is it 40 years, for example, of economic growth in the UK has actually corresponded with no increase whatsoever in our life satisfaction? Is that just a fact of life? Well, it's not true for all countries. In Denmark, for example, it appears to have risen quite markedly, right? So I think that is to do with the economy of regard. I can't explain all the details today, but I'm just saying to you, a positive thing that is sung is that in the wake of fiscal consolidations, sometimes people and governments, countries decide to do things differently. One of the ones that I think is certainly up for grabs at the moment is we get serious about the other things in this parallel economy, and in fact actually we'd be pretty pleased if we do so. Thank you.